Nevada Territory, July 1873. The wind kicked up dust around the wooden platform of the station yard in Carson City. And in the middle of it, all stood Grace Kittredge, her gloved hands gripping the handle of her carpet bag like it was the only thing tethering her to earth. The train had pulled away 15 minutes ago. No one had come to meet her. She wore her best lilac traveling dress, though the collar was tight and the bodice pinched where she'd sewn it in herself. Her light brown hair was pinned neat under a straw bonnet, but the heat prickled sweat at the back of her neck. She glanced around again. A drunk asleep on a bench, a boy chasing a chicken, a freight clerk chewing on a toothpick. No sign of the man who had written her 10 letters promising a house, a soft life, and his hand in marriage. Grace swallowed hard, heart-thudding. She opened her satchel and pulled out the last letter, dated 6 weeks back. "Wait for me by the water tower," it read. "You will be safe in my care." Edgar, she had been waiting. The sun was nearing its peak, and Edgar was nowhere. "Miss." A deep voice asked behind her. She turned fast, nearly dropping the bag. A tall man stood a few feet away, hat in hand, a soft dusting of trail dirt on his shirt and worn boots. His eyes were dark blue, sharp and steady, with a small scar tucked under his right cheekbone. He looked about 30, lean and strong, with the kind of face that did not lie. Are you waiting on someone?" he asked. Grace stiffened. "Yes, a man. He was supposed to meet me here. We were to be married." The cowboy shifted his weight. "I'm sorry to ask, but was his name Edgar Braze?" Her heart dropped. "Yes." He let out a breath, voice kind but low. "He was run out of town 3 weeks ago, caught swindling the bank, took off with near $2,000 in gold." "Sheriff still looking." Grace blinked. "You are sure?" "I saw the posters myself," he said. "I am real sorry." She stared at the ground. Her throat tightened, her chest hollowing out. The train was gone, her money was spent. She had no one waiting anywhere else. The cowboy stepped closer. "My name is Sawyer Trenton. I run cattle outside of Dayton, about 20 miles east. I do not usually involve myself in other folks' business, but I could not just walk away. You were standing here like you had nowhere to go." "I do not," she said quietly. Sawyer rubbed the back of his neck. "That man wronged you. You came all this way. You were brave to do that. I figure maybe I can help." "How?" He took a slow breath. "I lost my wife 3 years ago. I have 2 children. They need someone steady. I do not mean to rush you, miss, but I do not like the thought of you sleeping rough tonight. If you marry me before sundown, we can ride out and you will have a roof, food, and a place where you are needed." Grace stared at him, stunned. "You just met me." "I know," he said. "But I believe in doing right, and I know what it is to be alone." She looked around again. The station yard was hot and humming with strangers. There was no one else. Her chest ached with fear and something else, some strange warmth curling at the edges. He was not smiling, he was not charming. He was just offering her shelter, and something in his eyes said he meant it. She straightened. "What are your children's names?" "Finn is 7, Flora is 5. They are good but wild. Their grandmother raised them for a time, but she passed last winter." Grace nodded, the ache in her chest twisting into something closer to purpose. She had no home, no money, but she had her hands, her heart, and she had always wanted children. "Do you live near a church?" she asked. Sawyer's brows lifted just slightly. "There is one in Dayton. I know the preacher. He owes me a favor." She hesitated only a second more, then said, "All right." He blinked. "All right." She lifted her chin. "You asked me to marry you before sundown." "I accept." Sawyer looked at her like he had not expected her to say yes. Then something softened in his face and he gave a single nod. "We will ride now. We can be there by afternoon." They rode together on his horse, Grace sitting behind him, her arms around his waist. His scent was clean sweat and leather, and his back was strong beneath her hands. She did not speak much. Neither did he. But the wind in her face and the steady rhythm of the ride quieted the panic in her chest. Somewhere out there, a man had promised her lies. But right now, a stranger was offering her something real. By the time they reached Dayton, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the churchyard. Sawyer helped her down gently, his hands firm on her waist. A few townsfolk watched as they climbed the steps to the chapel, but no one said a word. The preacher, a gray-haired man named Josiah, married them with only the wind and the creaking wood as witness. Sawyer looked at her as he said the vows calm, steady, like a man who meant every word. Grace felt her hands tremble, but she kept her eyes on his. When it was done, he tipped his hat toward her and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me." It was not a kiss, but it was something. They rode another hour under the stars to his ranch. The house was small but clean, with a porch swing and smoke still curling from the chimney. A little boy with honey-blonde hair came running out, followed by a girl in a patched yellow dress. "Papa," the boy shouted. Sawyer swung down and caught him. "Finn, this is your new ma." Grace's breath caught. The children stared. Then Flora stepped forward, small hands on her hips. "Do you like stories?" "I do," Grace said gently. "Then you can stay," Flora declared. Grace laughed, a real sound, and Sawyer looked over at her, something easing in his face. That night, after the children were tucked into bed, Sawyer showed her to her room. "You can have the front room," he said. "Take your time. We can figure out what this is, slow if you like." Grace turned to him at the doorway. "You married me in a day," he held her gaze. "I would marry you again tomorrow." She felt her heart stir at that, not from fear, but from something new. And as she stepped into the room, she realized she was not alone anymore. The morning came soft and gray, a light mist hanging low across the pasture as Grace stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, brow damp. She moved slowly, careful not to make a mess of the biscuits. She'd found flour and lard in the pantry, and a tin of sorghum tucked behind a sack of dried beans. Flora had come in just after dawn, bare feet slapping the pine floor, and asked if she knew how to cook something that didn't taste like smoke. Grace had smiled and said she'd try. Now the girl sat cross-legged at the table, watching with a solemn kind of curiosity, while Finn leaned against the doorframe with a slingshot tucked into his waistband and a face full of suspicion. "You always get up this early?" he asked. "I do when there's work to be done," Grace said without turning. "My ma didn't like mornings." Grace paused, then set the biscuit tin down on the counter. "That's all right, I don't mind them." Sawyer came in from the barn, boots scuffing the threshold. He removed his hat, resting it on the hook by the door, then glanced toward the table. "They giving you trouble?" "Only their questions," Grace said, wiping her palms on her apron. He crossed to the basin and washed his hands. "If they ask anything out of line, you say so." "They haven't." She reached for the kettle, poured hot water into the tin cups she'd found in the hutch. "They're just figuring out who I am." He dried his hands on the towel draped across the chair. "You don't have to do all this." "I do," she said, not unkindly. Flora leaned forward. "Why'd you come with Papa if you didn't know him?" Grace set the stew pot on the back burner. "Because I had nowhere else to go, and he offered me kindness." Finn narrowed his eyes. "Kindness don't mean trust." "Trust takes time," she said, "but I believe it can grow." Sawyer met her gaze. "You still mean to stay?" Grace steadied the tin cup in her hands. "I said vows, I meant them." He nodded once, then turned to the children. "After breakfast, I want you both gathering kindling, and stay near the house." "We always stay close," Finn muttered, sliding onto the bench. The morning moved quiet, save the clatter of forks and the low murmur of Sawyer's voice as he told Finn to mind the coop door and asked Flora to help with the garden rows. Grace listened, memorizing the cadence of their lives when they took their meals, how the children answered, the way Sawyer touched Flora's hair lightly as he passed. When the table was cleared, Grace stepped out onto the porch. The sky had brightened, the mist lifting to reveal the long stretch of gold-green grass beyond the fence. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked toward the shed. Inside, she found sacks of feed, an old washtub, and a wooden bucket with a cracked handle. She carried it to the pump and worked the lever until water gushed out, then set about scrubbing the children's clothes from the day before. Sawyer appeared beside her, holding a pair of worn gloves. "You don't need to do that." She looked up. "They needed washing." He crouched beside her. "You're not a servant here, I know." She wrung out a damp shirt, her fingers red from the water. "But I've always believed a home is made, not given." He looked at her for a moment, then reached for the next shirt. "My wife used to say that." Grace didn't answer. A breeze stirred the grass, and the sound of birdsong rose from the trees near the creek. They worked side by side without speaking again, the rhythm of the task enough. By late afternoon, the children had returned with armfuls of branches, cheeks smudged and eyes bright. Grace met them on the porch with a basin and towel, and Flora leaned into her touch when she wiped the dirt from her face. Finn hesitated, but let her clean his hands without protest. That night, after the children were asleep, Grace sat on the edge of the porch, shawl tucked tight, eyes fixed on the stars. Sawyer joined her, a mug of coffee in his hands. "They took to you faster than I expected," he said. "I didn't give them reason not to," he nodded. "You always speak so plain. I find it saves time." He chuckled low, then sipped his coffee. "I don't know what you were expecting when you came west." "I wasn't," she said. "Expecting, I mean, I had no illusions." "You're not afraid?" She pulled her knees up beneath her skirt. "Of what? Of me? Of this? Of how little we know each other?" She turned to him. "I'm not afraid of work, I'm not afraid of quiet, and I'm not afraid of being needed." He studied her a long moment. "You're not like anyone I've met." I could say the same. The night deepened, crickets rising in the dark. Sawyer stood after a while, setting his empty mug on the rail. "You should sleep. Long day ahead tomorrow." Grace rose too, smoothing her skirt. "I'll be ready." He opened the door for her. As she stepped inside, he said softly, "I'm glad you came." She paused, then looked over her shoulder. "So am I." The next week unfolded in quiet turns. Days started before sunlight, ended after dusk, and Grace found herself filling the spaces between with steady hands and listening ears. She mended a rip in Finn's shirt with thread pulled from the hem of her own petticoat. She showed Flora how to pinch off the suckers on the tomato vines near the back fence. The house did not come alive with noise, but with the small marks of care. Warmer bread, boots placed in a row. A lullaby hummed low when the wind rattled the shutters. On the fifth morning, Sawyer stayed behind from the pasture. The cattle had been moved to higher grazing, and he needed to mend a section of the south fence before the rains came. He saddled the mule and hitched a crate of cedar rails, then turned to Grace beneath the porch awning. "I could use another pair of hands if you're willing." Grace tied her bonnet under her chin. "I brought gloves." They rode out past the orchard, the air thick with the scent of wild sage. The trail narrowed where the hillside sloped down into cottonwood and willow. The fence line ran along a dry creek, most of it still standing, though in one section the posts had rotted clear through. Sawyer stepped down first, then reached up to help her dismount. Her boots hit the earth soft, and she looked up to find his gaze close. "You don't need to prove yourself." "I'm not," she said. "I'm just living my own life." He gave a slow nod, then passed her a hammer. They worked side by side, Grace bracing the posts while Sawyer drove the nails. The sun climbed and sweat broke across their brows, but neither complained. When the last rail was fastened, they sat in the shade of a juniper tree, passing a canteen between them. Sawyer rested his forearms on his knees. "You write to your folks back east?" "I haven't," Grace said. "My father passed 3 winters ago. My mother remarried and moved to Ohio." "I don't know where." He nodded once, then picked a leaf from his boot. "I used to think I couldn't raise the children right without help. Then I started thinking maybe no one ever does it right, just the best they can." "Children don't need perfect," Grace said. "They need someone who stays." He looked over. "You mean to?" I said vows. He watched her for a moment longer, then pushed to his feet. "Come on, we'll be back by supper." By the time they reached the house, the sky was streaked orange and the wind carried a chill. Grace stepped through the door to find Flora crouched by the hearth, feeding the fire with bits of bark. Finn stood behind her, holding a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" Grace asked. Finn handed it to her. "I drew something." She unfolded it carefully. A pencil sketch, rough but clear, a small house, smoke curling from the chimney. 4 figures, one taller than the rest, a woman's shape in a long dress. "That's you," Flora said, pointing. Grace's mouth parted, but no words came. "You don't have to hang it up," Finn said quickly. "I just wanted to show you." "I'll keep it," she said, folding it and pressing it to her chest. "Thank you." Later that night, the wind picked up and a hard rain came. Grace sat by the window, sewing a patch on a blanket, when Sawyer entered with a towel slung over his shoulder. "You warm enough?" he asked. "I am." He crossed the room and leaned against the doorframe. "I'd like to build another room onto the back of the house. Come spring." She looked up. "For what purpose? For you. You deserve a space of your own." She set the blanket aside. "I'm not here as a guest, I know. All the same, I want to do it." She stood slowly. "You don't have to build to show care. I'm not building to prove anything. I'm building because you're here, because I want you to stay." The silence filled with the sound of rain on the roof. Grace took a step toward him. "Then I'll help you raise the frame come spring." He straightened. "You do that?" "I would." He looked down at her, something unspoken passing between them. Then he reached out, not to pull her close, but to let his fingers brush against hers. She didn't move away. Above them, the wind howled, but the house held firm. And for the first time in years, Grace felt like she did too. The following week brought with it a hard frost. Grace woke to the windows rimmed in white, the garden stiff with ice, and the horses breathing clouds into the morning air. She pulled on Sawyer's spare coat. It hung long and broad on her shoulders, and stepped into the yard with a basket tucked under her arm. The hens needed feeding, and the coop's door had begun to sag on its hinges. She bent to inspect it, noting the cracked latch and the way the bottom corner scraped the dirt. Behind her, Sawyer's footsteps crunched over frozen leaves. "That coat's near swallowing you," he said. Grace straightened, brushing her hands on her skirt. "It's warm." "I'll stitch mine thicker once I find wool." "You'll have it," he said. "There's a trader coming down from Virginia City next week. He'll stop through." She nodded. "The coop door's giving out." "I'll fix it before the thaw," he said. "You've a good eye for things coming loose." "My father was a wheelwright. It was my job to watch for what might give before it did." Sawyer stepped closer, glancing toward the barn. "I didn't know that about you." "You never asked," she said, not unkindly. He rubbed his palms together, breath rising white. "I'd like to know more." She hesitated, then said, "He kept a ledger for every job, drawings, measurements, notes in the corners. I'd copy them at night by lantern light. Said it would keep my hands steady." "You still draw?" "I haven't in years," she said. "I left the habit behind when I left the shop." He nodded, then gestured toward the pasture. "Come with me. There's something I want you to see." He led her out past the fence line, where the grass rolled open to the low hills. They crossed a shallow gully, boots sinking into brittle clumps of grass, and came to a stand of cottonwoods. Beyond them sat a small ridge where the land dipped into a sheltered hollow. "It's ours," he said, stopping at the top. "I bought it 2 winters past. Figured I'd plant orchard here someday." Grace looked out. The hollow was thick with bramble and rock, but sunlight gathered there, soft and golden despite the frost. A hawk circled high above. "You want to farm it?" "In time," he said. "I wasn't sure I'd get to it. Didn't seem much point alone." She turned slightly. "And now, I'm not alone anymore." The words weren't heavy. They didn't carry expectation. They just landed quiet and true. She looked back toward the hollow. "There's water, a spring down there. Slow but clean," she nodded. "If you dig terraces there, you'll catch runoff from the ridge. Keep the roots fed even in dry seasons." He tilted his head. "You know soil." "I know how to read what grows where." He watched her for a moment. "You ever think of having land of your own?" She folded her arms against the cold. "I thought of a shop, a place with windows and quiet. But the West doesn't leave much room for sitting behind glass." "You could have both." "I could," she said, "if it was built with care." They stood in silence, wind tugging at the hem of her skirt. Then she said, "You brought me here to ask something?" "I did," Sawyer said. "I want to build this place with you, not just the house, not just the room, all of it." She met his eyes. "You're not asking for gratitude or duty." "No," he said, "I'm asking for you." Grace looked out across the hollow again. The wind moved through the cottonwoods and a pair of deer stepped quietly from the brush, pausing to drink from the spring below. She felt her heart steady. "I'll plant with you come spring," she said, "and I'll stay through winter." He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "That's all I could want." She didn't move away. That night, Grace sat with Flora beside the hearth, showing her how to stitch a hem along a flour sack apron. Finn leaned against the wall nearby, carving a piece of wood into a crude horse. Sawyer sat by the window, mending a saddle strap, his eyes lifting now and again to watch them. "Papa," Flora said, "can we have bees?" Sawyer set the leather aside. "Bees for honey," she said. "Miss Grace says bees mean strong flowers." He looked at Grace, a small crease at the corner of his mouth. "Is that so?" She smiled slightly. "It's true." He leaned back in his chair. "Then we'll build hives when the frost breaks." Grace threaded a needle and passed it to Flora. She didn't speak, but her heart swelled a little. After the children slept, Sawyer met her at the table where she'd laid out the sketch Finn had given her. She'd begun to trace over it with a steady hand, adding a porch, a line of trees, a narrow chimney. "You've still got the habit," he said softly. She looked up. "I'll draw the orchard next." He reached across the table, his hand settling atop hers. "Draw anything you want, we'll make it real." She didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. And in that stillness, something quiet and whole settled between them. The last snow came in early March. Not a heavy fall, just a veil of white that melted by midday, leaving the soil dark and eager. Grace stood at the back of the house, hands in her apron pockets, watching Sawyer and Finn dig the first trench that would mark the edge of the orchard. Flora sat nearby on a flat stone, winding string around a small bundle of willow switches. Sawyer glanced up and called out, "You think this line's true?" Grace stepped down, boots sinking slightly. "You'll lose sunlight in the far corner if you plant that close to the rise." He leaned on the shovel, squinting toward the ridge. "You think we pull it in a pace or two?" "3," she said, kneeling beside the line he'd marked with twine. "The slope'll shade them by late afternoon." He nodded and began shifting the trench inward. Finn followed suit, mimicking his father's motion with a smaller spade Sawyer had carved for him out of pine. Grace stood and brushed her palms together. "I'll start soaking the roots. They'll set better if the soil's damp when they go in." Back inside, she filled the half-barrel Sawyer had fixed with pitch, then moved to the hearth to check the bread she'd risen early to bake. The house smelled of yeast and wood ash, and something in her chest eased further each day. That steady rhythm held. By the time the sun began to dip, the first row of saplings stood planted, each tied with twine to a trimmed stake. Sawyer wiped his brow with his sleeve and looked down the line. "Didn't think we'd get this far today." Grace handed him a tin cup of cool well water. "You'd get farther if you'd stop trying to do it all yourself." He took the cup, but his eyes stayed on her face. "I've never had someone beside me who sees what needs doing before I've asked. I've always paid attention," she said. "There's a difference between quiet and absence." He set the cup down. "You ever think you'd have this?" "No," she said. "But I think I knew, once I stepped off that train, that if I stayed still long enough something good might find me." Flora ran up then, cheeks pink, hands full of early shoots she'd pulled from the creek's edge. "Can we plant these too? They smell like spring." Grace crouched and took the bundle. "They're wild mint. If we set them near the kitchen door, they'll keep the flies off come summer." "Will they grow fast?" Flora asked. "They will," Grace said. "With care." That night, after the children were asleep, Sawyer brought in a wrapped bundle from the saddlebag he'd left by the door. He set it on the table in front of her, then stepped back. "I traded for this with the last of the pelts from last season." Grace opened the cloth slowly. Inside sat a set of drawing pencils, wrapped in oiled paper, and a leather-bound sketchbook with a clasp worn smooth at the edges. "I thought you might want to keep some of what we're building," he said, her breath caught not from surprise but from the quiet understanding behind the gesture. She ran her fingers over the spine. "I didn't realize how much I missed it. You don't have to draw anything for me." Just for you, she looked up at him. You've never asked anything for yourself. I've wanted things, he said, voice low. I just never thought I had the right to. Grace stood and crossed the space between them. She reached up, resting her hand on his chest, over the place where his shirt opened just slightly to the hollow of his throat. You do, she said. You've built a life worth sharing. His hands found her waist, careful and certain. Then let me share it with you, all of it. Not just the work or the land or the children. I want to wake beside you, not across the hall. I want to be your husband in truth. Grace didn't answer with words. She rose onto her toes and kissed him, slow and sure, her hands slipping up to his shoulders. He kissed her back with the kind of steadiness that had defined everything about him from the day they met. No rush, no doubt, just a promise made real. By the time the fire burned low, they had moved together with the same quiet ease as everything else they'd built. No need for declarations. Just the soft hush of cotton sheets and the warmth of shared breath in the dark. Spring came early that year. The orchard filled in slowly, saplings leafing out with a pale green that caught the light. Grace planted mint by the kitchen door, just as she'd promised Flora, and filled the window boxes with marigold seeds. Finn built a scarecrow from old canvas and a broken rake handle. Sawyer carved initials into the corner post of the porch, hers and his, just a small mark to say, "This is ours." Grace kept her sketchbook near, sometimes drawing in the quiet hours before dawn. She captured the bend of Flora's neck when she leaned over her stitching, the curve of Sawyer's shoulder as he lifted a sack of seed, the shadows that played across the barn's wall at sunset. She never showed them, but he always seemed to know when she'd finished one. One morning in late May, Sawyer came in with a folded paper in his hand. Letter from Carson. They're auctioning a parcel near the creek, 20 acres. Grace raised an eyebrow. You thinking of buying more land? I'm thinking of building a schoolhouse, he said. The children will need more than what I can teach them, and the nearest school's too far to walk in winter. She set down the loaf she was kneading. You want to bring in a teacher? I want you to be the teacher, he said. You've got the mind for it, and the patience. Grace stilled. You think the town would allow that? They'll follow my lead, and they'll see soon enough you've got more sense than the lot of them. She considered it. I'll need books. You'll have them, she smiled. Then I'll need benches too. I'll carve them myself. That summer they built the small schoolhouse just beyond the orchard. Grace painted the door blue, Flora helped her sort the slates, and Finn carried the ink bottles in his hat. On the first morning of lessons, 6 children sat in the front row, their faces scrubbed and serious. Grace stood before the blackboard, her hands steady. Sawyer watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a quiet pride in his eyes. That night they sat on the porch swing as the stars came out. Sawyer pulled her close, her head resting on his shoulder, the air thick with honeysuckle and the hum of crickets. You happy? He asked. She nodded. More than I knew I could be. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Then I've done right by you. You've done more than right, she said. You gave me a place to belong. And there, beneath the wide Nevada sky, with the orchard behind them and the lantern light spilling warm through the windows of their home, they held each other close, no longer strangers, no longer waiting, but 2 people who had built a life from trust, from kindness, and from love that asked for nothing but the chance to grow. They never had to look back again.